Sister always involves my room, but this time become unique. Got here in at night time. Idea it became just another informal go-to. However, once I woke up, something fell off. The glances, the touches. Happened next became each shocking and surprisingly exciting. Night, with our parents away on a weekend trip, it changed into just the two people. House become unusually silent, and a hurricane outdoor handiest made the silence sense more severe. I sat at the couch scrolling through my smartphone. Well, came in with 2 cups of tea. Concept you would possibly want one, she stated, handing it to me with a gentle smile. I took it, smiling lower back. Though I may want to experience that unusual anxiety once more. Thank you, Lisa. I responded, seeking to keep matters casual, as though the abnormal air among us wasn't there. Sat beside me a touch nearer than traditional, sinking slightly beneath her weight. Made small speak for some time about matters that did not sincerely be counted, the climate, a brand new movie. Watched funny stories from school, however below it I ought to sense something unstated, something striking among us that I couldn't quite place a name to. I tried to snicker it off, blaming my overactive creativeness, however I knew that would not shake the sensation. Keep in mind that summer season we spent at the lake residence, she asked abruptly. Voice low. Yeah. I responded, smiling. How could I overlook? You practically lived in the water. Chuckled, her eyes warm with the memory. I recall you had been so patient with me, teaching me how to swim, even though I was horrible at it. I laughed. You have been terrible. But Shaw. I cherished it. Became one in every of my favorite summers. Silence that accompanied become heavy. Looked at me, her gaze softer than I was used to. Hand rested at the couch, just a piece closer to mine than I anticipated. Arms brushing mine lightly. She shifted for a second. I felt the air around us thicken. Coronary heart started out beating quicker, and I wasn't positive why this turned into my little sister, the kid I'd taught how to swim, who had pestered me with 1 million questions developing up. You ever consider how matters could have been if we did not have all the chaos? Asked, her voice barely a whisper. I peeked down, not certain how to respond. Family changed into complicated. To mention the least, we'd had our fair proportion of turmoil, arguments, damaged guarantees, nights spent hoping matters would exchange. Had made us close in ways most siblings weren't, but I puzzled now if perhaps we had been too near. Every so often, I admitted looking away, my gaze settling on the window in which traces down the glass. But it's not something we can alternate, right? We will do is live with it. Yeah, she responded, even though there has been a bizarre disappointment in her voice, but now and again I desire it may be different. I turned again to him, amazed. Her eyes were dark, considerate, packed with something I did not pretty apprehend. A smooth flash of lightning illuminated the room for a 2D, and that I observed the way her hand become now simply barely touching mine. Hands lightly grazing my knuckles. I pulled my hand, returned instinctively, forcing a laugh to break the anxiety. Observe us getting all deep and mawkish, we sound so grown up. Smiled, however it failed to reach her eyes. Wager. We have been via plenty. I nodded, and the silence back. I felt an urge to trade the subject, to carry us again to the smooth laughter we used to share. However, every time I attempted, I felt that weight once more, that lingering tension. I could not pretty shake. What approximately you, she requested. Suddenly her voice low once more. You ever feel lonely? Query took me through marvel, and I felt my cheeks flush slightly. Every now and then, yeah, but I imply who would not proper? Stated softly, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. It's simply you are always there for everyone. Deal with anybody but yourself, a person has to, I stated, seeking to brush it off. However, the way she checked out me told me she did not purchase it. hurricane outside become growing louder, rain beating in opposition to the home windows as thunder rumbled within the distance. Changed into bizarre how the noise appeared to deliver the silence in her into sharper focus, as if every drop of rain emphasized the quiet among us. "I don't want you to experience like you have to deal with me," she stated, voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I need us to attend to every different." I checked out her surprised by way of the intensity in her eyes. Reached out her hand resting lightly on mine, her thumb brushing over my knuckles in a gesture so gentle it nearly harm. There has been something within the manner she checked out me that made my heart bypass, something that felt both comforting and unsettling unexpectedly. I wanted to pull away to snicker it off to break the tension come what may, however I could not. I used to be frozen trapped in her gaze, feeling my pulse race as her fingers traced mild circles on my hand. "It's overdue." I ultimately controlled to mention, my voice sounding bizarre to my personal ears. "Ought to probably get a few sleep," she nodded, even though she failed to pass right away, her eyes nevertheless fixed on mine for a second. I concept she became going to say something else, something that might change the whole thing. However, she just gave me a small, sad smile and stood up. "Good night," murmured, her hand slipping from mine as she turned and walked down the hall, her footsteps tender against the wood floor. I watched her pass, my heart pounding in my chest, the peculiar weight of the evening settling over me like a blanket. I couldn't shake off the sound of her door closing echoed within the quiet. Me by myself with my thoughts, the memories of her contact, the look in her eyes, the words she hadn't stated, lingering within the darkness as I sat there inside the silence, staring at the empty hallway. I felt an odd feel of anticipation. Something changed into changing, something I could not quite call. However, I knew deep down that things could in no way be the same, and by some means I wasn't positive if I desired them to be. Identical day at nighttime, I was slumbering in my room and that I felt an unusual contact. I thought, it is simply my mind, and that I not noted it. However, then the unusual kisses on my neck woke me up, and to my marvel, it turned into, "What the hell are you doing?" "Lisa," I stated. However, without answering, she left the room and ran away. The times that observed that nighttime have been marked by an uncomfortable silence that appeared to hold between us, filling every interaction with an interest that wasn't there before. I attempted to tell myself it changed into not anything, that I was overthinking things, that this was just some other section. But irrespective of how a lot I tried to sweep it off, I could not neglect the way had checked out me, the feel of her hand on mine, the quiet longing I concept I visible in her eyes. I used to be on area, constantly privy to her presence, hyper-aware about each look, each small touch that felt heavier. I'd capture myself looking him out of the corner of my eye, questioning what she became questioning, thinking if she felt it too. But she changed into as unreadable as ever, calm and informal, as though not anything had changed. Turned into maddening. Afternoon, as I used to be heading to my room, I found her sitting at the floor, outdoor, her back in opposition to the wall, a pocketbook open on her knees. Seemed up as I approached her, expression guarded as if she'd been looking ahead to me. "Good day," she stated quietly, her gaze steady. "Got a minute?" I nodded, uncertain of what to anticipate, my heart pounding as I sat down beside him. Silence stretched between us, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, slightly greater than a whisper. "I recognize matters have been weird." Started, her eyes constant at the floor. "Between us, I suggest. And that I don't want you to experience uncomfortable." I swallowed, feeling an abnormal blend of remedy and tension. "It is okay, Lisa. I'm simply looking to figure things out, me neither." I whispered the phrases, slipping out before I could prevent them. Reached out, her hand brushing mine, the contact sending a shiver down my spine. Sat there, frozen in that second, our hands barely touching. However, the connection between us feeling more potent than something I might ever recognized. A moment I desired to turn away to break the spell that had wrapped around us. However, something in her gaze held me in location, a silent plea that I could not ignore. I felt my clear-up weaken, the partitions I might constructed round myself crumbling as I allow myself lean nearer, just sufficient to experience her breath against my pores and skin. "I don't know how to prevent this," murmured her voice, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart pain. I looked at her, my pulse racing, every nerve in my body alive with a tension that felt each terrifying and interesting. Perhaps we don't ought to," the words hung within the air between us, a tentative provide, a step into the unknown. I should see the hesitation in her eyes, the struggle. But there was something else too, a spark, a quiet dedication that made my coronary heart race. Reached out her fingers, brushing my cheek, her touch so mild it felt like a whisper. I closed my eyes, feeling the warm temperature of her hand, the smooth brush of her thumb against my pores and skin. For a second, I permit myself overlook the entirety else. There has been simplest this moment, this contact, this connection that felt as natural as respiration. But the silence that accompanied became thick, heavy with the conclusion of what we'd done. The line we'd crossed. I opened my eyes, assembling her gaze, and noticed the identical aggregate of worry and preference that I felt, a mirrored image of the confusion swirling interior me. Cannot do that," I whispered, even though, whilst I stated the phrases, I felt a pang of remorse, a longing I could not forget about. "I know," she replied, her voice difficult, her hand dropping from my cheek. However, she did not shy away, did not leave. Alternatively, she stayed, her eyes locked on mine, her gaze filled with a depth that made my heart ache. Sat there, the silence between us, more effective than any phrases, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings we could not deny, the limits we'd crossed. I knew deep down that this turned into a route. Should not move down a line we shouldn't have crossed. But in that second, along with her gaze maintaining mine, I felt a simple pull, a longing that wouldn't be silenced, and that I knew with a certainty that terrified me that this changed into best the start. The following evening, a quiet anxiety stuffed the house, thick and palpable. Air regarded charged, as though looking ahead to something to appear, something inevitable. And that I moved around every other within the dwelling room, pretending to look at a movie. Even though neither of us turned into absolutely focused on the display screen, my mind changed into someplace else on the weight of her glances, the way her presence appeared to fill every corner of the room. Because the movie drowned on in the heritage. I felt my heart beat quicker, the familiar fluttering in my chest returning with a pressure I could now not ignore. I stole a look at who became leaning lower back on the sofa beside me. Gaze constant someplace beyond the display, her expression unreadable. There has been a tension in her posture, a quiet intensity that matched the racing of my very own mind. In the end, not able to face the silence any further, I turned to her, my voice slightly a whisper. "Are you okay?" Looked at me, her eyes darker than traditional, filled with an emotion I could not quite call, "I don't know." Admitted, her voice smooth, almost prone. I preserve thinking about us, about what's happening. Phrases hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Breath caught as I felt her gaze choose me, her eyes looking mine as if seeking out solutions. She reached over, her hand resting on pinnacle of mine, her fingers heat and constant. I felt my pulse quicken the contact, sending a shiver down my backbone. I failed to pull away. I could not. As an alternative, I discovered myself leaning into the warmth of her hand, my fingers curling around her, holding on to the moment as if it were something treasured, fragile. There was a type of silence that filled the room. A quiet expertise that needed no words. Moved closer, her arm brushing against mine, her presence overwhelming. I may want to sense her breath warm and steady as she checked out me. Gaze severe, unwavering. Before I knew it, she lifted her hand, brushing a strand of hair from my face, her fingers lingering towards my cheek. "Is this okay?" she requested, her voice slightly greater than a whisper, her eyes looking mine for permission. I nodded, slightly capable of discovering my voice, my heart racing as I felt her hand on my face, her touch, soft, mild. Eyes closed for a moment, savoring the warmth, the closeness, the way her hand felt in opposition to my skin. Turned into a feeling I might never skilled before, a sort of comfort mixed with pleasure, something each acquainted and new, then almost hesitant. Leaned in her lips, brushing mine in a soft, tentative kiss. Changed into a kiss that felt like a query, an unstated request for something greater, something deeper. Breath hitched as I leaned into him, my personal lips responding, answering her silent question with a quiet truth that surprised even me. Kiss deepened. Gradual and gentle, every second unfolding like a mystery. Hands slid to the return of my neck, pulling me nearer, and I felt myself surrendering to the warmth, the tenderness, the feeling of being absolutely and wholly wrapped up in him. There has been a quiet intensity to the manner she's held me, a form of gentleness that made my coronary heart pain. Breaths mingled because the kiss continued, every touch, each movement developing more assured, extra certain. Became as though we were discovering something hidden among us, something that had usually been there waiting to be exposed. I ought to feel the beat of her heart steady and strong, matching the rhythm of my own. A silent promise in the darkness. Pulled back slightly, her brow resting in opposition to mine, her eyes closed, her respiratory heavy. A second we stayed like that, stuck inside the stillness, neither folks bold to talk, to interrupt the delicate quiet that had settled over us. "I've wanted this for so long," whispered her voice thick with emotion. I just failed to understand how to say it. I reached up my arms, brushing her cheek, feeling the warm temperature of her pores and skin, the roughness of her stubble. "Too," I admitted, my voice slightly audible, but I didn't think failed to assume you felt the identical. Opened her eyes, her gaze severe, filled with a quiet willpower. "I have attempted to cover it, to fake it wasn't there, but I can't anymore. I do not need to faux." Words dispatched a thrill through me, a quiet confirmation of the whole lot I'd been feeling, the emotions I would been seeking to deny. I felt myself smile, a gentle, almost shy smile as I looked at him, my hand resting on her cheek, my coronary heart full of a warmth I hadn't felt in a long term. Leaned in again, her lips locating mine, the kiss deeper, this time packed with a quiet urgency, a want that neither of us ought to deny. Arms moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and that I felt myself melting into him, into the moment, into the feeling of being completely fed on by way of her. Was as if the universe condensed to this singular second, the world outside guidelines and expectancies dissolving into insignificance. That existed became the mild strain of her touch, the warmth of her gaze, and the profound experience of being visible, understood, and loved. Hand traced the curve of my back, sending shivers down my backbone. I instinctively drew closer, my arms intertwining along with her, our bodies swaying in perfect concord. Lost all, which means as we surrendered to the depth of the moment. I felt the rush of emotions, the joys of connection, and the safety of being enveloped in her presence. On this fleeting immediately we had been unstoppable, untethered, and unguarded. Connection transcended words, a symphony of emotions playing in ideal sync. Closeness became exhilarating yet terrifying, like status on the precipice of a new sunrise. Yet in her hands I discovered solace, an experience of belonging that rejected clarification. When we eventually pulled again, respiratory closely, she checked out me. Gaze packed with a mixture of surprise and awe, as if she couldn't quite consider what had simply happened. "I do not know wherein that is going," admitted, her voice slightly greater than a whisper, "but I do not need to prevent. I don't want to move lower back." I nodded, feeling an odd feel of fact settle over me. "Do I?" Sat there within the quiet, our fingers nevertheless intertwined, a sense of peace filling the room, a quiet guarantee that no matter what got here subsequent, we would face it collectively. Changed into a sense that turned into each comforting and terrifying, awareness that this turned into something we could not ignore, could not run from. The silence stretched on, relaxed and packed with unstated promises. I felt her thumb brush over my knuckles, a small, smooth gesture that made my heart pain with a quiet joy. Changed into as though in that moment, the whole lot else diminished away, leaving simplest the two of us caught in an international of our very own making. As the night wore on, we stayed near, our quiet whispers filling the darkness, a silent conversation of shared glances and mild touches, every one deepening the bond among us, each one pulling us nearer. Become a closeness that felt both new and familiar, a connection that had been ready within the shadows, awaiting the proper moment to come back to lifestyles, and now there has been no turning lower back. The times that accompanied felt like a blur filled with stolen moments, quiet conversations, and a connection that appeared to grow more potent with each shared glance. And I moved around every different with a new knowledge, an unspoken promise that neither people had to voice aloud. Turned into as if a door had opened between us, mean to a place we by no means dared to imagine, an area that felt forbidden and yet unusually proper. Each day we discovered ourselves drawn to every other in methods that had been difficult to disregard, passing each different in the hallway, a broom of hands inside the kitchen, a lingering appearance that appeared to mention the whole thing we couldn't place into words. I felt my heart race each time she became near, a feeling that was both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder of how tons had changed between us. Evening as the sun dipped under the horizon, casting a heat glow via the windows. I discovered myself sitting within the backyard looking. The sector grew quiet, the air turned into cool and a smooth breeze stirred the leaves, filling the silence with a gentle rustling that in some way made the instant sense even extra intimate. Glanced over at me, her expression gentle, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I by no means notion we'd be right here," murmured her voice, barely more than a whisper. "Did I?" I responded, an experience of surprise filling me, however I do not remorse it. Reached out her hand, locating mine, her arms warm and regular, me neither. A while we sat there hand in hand, looking because the sky darkened, stars starting to seem one by one. It felt like we have been in an international of our very own, an area untouched to reality, in which not anything else mattered, but the quiet connection among us. Turned into a peace I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging that filled me with a quiet joy. However, as the days handed, truth commenced to creep lower back in a quiet reminder that the arena outside became nonetheless there waiting. I started to feel the load of our mystery, the unstated anxiety of what we might end up. I knew that our lives couldn't stay in this hidden corner forever, that ultimately we should face the consequences of what we would determine. Afternoon, as we had been sitting collectively within the residing room, the quiet ticking of the clock appeared louder than typical, each tick a reminder of time slipping away. I grew to become to a knot of fear, twisting in my chest. "What are we going to do?" I requested, my voice trembling slightly. She looked at me, her expression considerate, a disappointment in her eyes that mirrored my very own. "I don't know," she admitted, her hand reaching for mine. "However, whatever occurs, we're going to face it collectively." Words brought a sense of consolation, a reassurance that eased the knot in my chest. Only for a moment I nodded, conserving onto her hand as though it were a lifeline, grounding me in a truth that felt as fragile as a dream. Night, as I lay in mattress, my thoughts racing with thoughts of what lay beforehand. I found out just how plenty she's supposed to me, how deeply she'd turn out to be part of my existence. With that recognition came a sense of fear, a quiet dread that gnawed at me, reminding me that everything we had become balanced on a delicate aspect, a line we couldn't go without risking the whole lot. The subsequent days had been filled with a quiet tension, an undercurrent of uncertainty that neither folks dared to deal with. Went through the motions of our routines, pretending that the whole thing became the equal, that our lives hadn't been irrevocably modified. But each glance, each contact, every quiet second collectively reminded me that this was not just a passing segment, that this changed into something deeper, something that had taken root in my heart. Nighttime as we sat collectively on the porch, the celebrities twinkling above us. I felt a surge of emotion, a need to say something, to put into words, the emotions that were constructing internal me. Lisa. I started out, my voice barely extra than a whisper. I don't know what the destiny holds. I don't know if we are able to maintain going like this. Checked out me, her gaze full of information, a disappointment that echoed my own. I realize, she spoke back softly. However anything happens, you may always have a place in my heart. Phrases filled me with a bittersweet pain, an experience of longing that I could not forget about. I knew that what we had become uncommon, something valuable. However, it became also something that couldn't final, a fleeting moment that might ultimately fade away. Yet in that moment, with her hand in mine, I felt a quiet peace, a reality that regardless of what came subsequent, I might deliver this reminiscence with me, a part of him all the time etched into my coronary heart. Because the days was weeks, I felt the burden of our secret growing heavier, the quiet know-how that this turned into something we couldn't keep hidden all the time. Started to drag again, a silent expertise that this become a bankruptcy that would quickly ought to near, a tale that could stay hours locked away in the quiet spaces of our hearts. Evening as we sat together in the dim light of the dwelling room, I checked out, a sense of finality settling over me. I think it is time we allow pass. I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Nodded at unhappiness in her eyes, but additionally a quiet attractiveness. Perhaps you are proper, she answered, her hand resting on mine. However, that does not mean this wasn't actual. Does not imply it failed to matter. Sat there in silence. Hands intertwined, a shared know-how that this became a moment we would each convey with us, a memory that would remain even if the sector around us moved on. I looked at her, a tear slipped down my cheek. A quiet acknowledgement of the lack of the ending that we both knew changed into inevitable. Reached up, wiping the tear away, her touch gentle, a final act of tenderness that felt like a goodbye. Inside the days that accompanied, we slowly drifted apart, a quiet distance settling between us, a space packed with the echoes of the whole lot we might shared. Went returned to our workouts, our lives intertwining in quieter, subtler ways, as siblings, as friends, as individuals who had shared something that might never be spoken of again. But even as we lower back to the jobs, the arena predicted folks, I knew that what we had was something rare, something that had changed me in methods I couldn't fully recognize. Although we failed to communicate of it, I ought to feel that she carried it with him too, a quiet reminder of a time when we might let our hearts lead, even supposing handiest for a fleeting moment. Within the years that accompanied our lives took us in one-of-a-kind instructions, paths that diverged yet constantly seemed to lead return to every other. There was a consolation in understanding that she became there, a constant presence, a quiet guarantee that irrespective of what, we might always have that unstated bond. Even though the memory of those days dwindled over the years, growing softer, quieter, it remained part of me, a quiet echo that reminded me of the individual I would been of. The love we would shared, but, in brief, a few matters I found out are meant to be treasured, quietly carried within the coronary heart like a secret, a reminiscence that most effective grows more precious with time. Even though existence moved on sporting us with it, that part of my heart would constantly be her, a quiet corner that no one else would ever touch. By no means noted it once more. Have become our silent knowledge. Shared her, a chapter that might remain for all time. Locked away inside the quiet spaces of reminiscence, and although our lives had moved ahead over time had changed us, I knew that she would constantly be part of me as I used to be a part of him. Changed into a love that wanted no phrases, no explanations, just the quiet reality that we had been there, that we had cherished, even if best inside the silence of our personal hearts.